Their answer shocked the room. This isn't a coincidence that you seeing this right now. Somebody asked your person a question last night that they were not prepared for. They were in a room full of people, not strangers, not a party, but the kind of small gathering where everyone has known each other long enough to ask the real questions. The lights were low. The food had already been cleared. There were maybe 6 or 7 of them left, the ones who always stay later than they should, leaning back in their chairs with that loose end of the night honesty that only happens after midnight. And then someone, half joking, half not, turned to your person and said it. Okay, real answer. Who do you actually love? Like, right now, today, no performance. The room laughed at first. The way rooms always laugh at questions like that. Because everyone assumes the answer will be a deflection, a joke, a name nobody's expecting, just to keep things light. That's the script. That's how these moments are supposed to go. Your person didn't follow the script. They looked down at their glass. They turned it once, slowly, against the wood of the table. And then they said your name. Not a nickname. Not a, well, there was this person. Not a careful, plausibly, deniable answer with a smile to soften it. They said your name. Clearly, quietly, the full sound of it. And the room went still. That's the part one need you to understand. The shock wasn't in the volume of what they said. It was in the simplicity. There was no caveat. There was no, but it's complicated. There was just the name, sitting in the middle of the table, and a person on the other side of it who had finally stopped pretending. One of their friends actually set their drink down. Another one didn't know where to look. Someone said, softly, wait, really? And your person nodded once. That was all. Now let me pull back, because I want to tell you what was happening underneath the moment, the part the other people in the room couldn't see. Your person had spent the entire evening managing themselves. That's the only way to put it. They had walked in carrying something they hadn't unpacked all week, a heaviness they couldn't trace, a feeling that had been hovering for days. They told themselves they would be fine if they kept moving, kept talking, kept laughing at the right beats. And for most of the night, they were. They held it together. They poured drinks. They told a story everyone had heard before, just to keep the energy where it was supposed to be. But that question landed at the exact moment their defenses were thinnest. Have you ever had that happen to you? Where you spend an entire day building a wall around something, and then one ordinary sentence from someone who doesn't even know what they're doing comes in sideways and takes the whole wall down? That's what happened to them. They didn't decide to say your name. The name came up out of them, the way the truth sometimes does when the body finally gets tired of carrying it. If this message is finding you at the right moment, comment, I receive this love, like the video, and subscribe. There's more coming for you. Here's what I want you to picture, because the details matter. The room was warm in that low end of the night way. There was a candle on the table that had burned down past its halfway mark. The music had been turned off 40 minutes ago and nobody had bothered to put it back on, because the conversation had finally found its rhythm. There was a small bowl of something on the table, olives, maybe, or the last of some snack, and your person had been picking at it absently for half an hour without really eating. The friend who asked the question wasn't trying to corner them. It was a casual, slightly tipsy curiosity. The kind of question people ask when they stopped performing the polite version of themselves. Who do you actually love? No one was supposed to take it seriously. Your person took it seriously because, in that moment, they didn't have the energy to take it any other way. And after they said your name, after the room paused, after the friend across the table whispered wait, really, something even more telling happened. Your person did not take it back. That's important. Notice that. In a normal night, in a normal version of themselves, they would have laughed it off 2 seconds later. They would have said I am kidding, never mind, ignore me. They would have built the wall back up before anyone could really look behind it. That's the move. That's what people do when they accidentally said too much. They didn't do the move. They just held the silence. They picked up their drink. They took a small sip. And they let the answer stay where they had put it. Now, what nobody at that table knew, what your person themselves didn't fully know in the moment, is that something had been building inside them for weeks. The heaviness I mentioned earlier wasn't random. It was the slow, accumulated weight of trying to convince themselves of something that wasn't true. Trying to convince themselves they had moved past you. Trying to convince themselves the chapter was closed. Trying to convince themselves that the small, quiet thoughts about you were just leftovers from an older self, and they'd fade if they were ignored long enough. The thoughts had not faded, and the more they ignored them, the louder they became. That's why your name came out so easily when the question was asked, because it had been sitting at the front of their mouth for a long time. They had been swallowing it down at every dinner, every coffee with a friend, every quiet drive home. It had become a kind of small physical pressure behind their teeth, and the question, asked at the wrong hour by the wrong person in the right tone, finally let it out. After they said it, after the room went still and then quietly started to move again, the way rooms do when something true has been spoken, they did not look up for a while. They studied the candle. They watched the small flame bend in a draft they couldn't feel. They were waiting for the embarrassment to arrive. The embarrassment did not arrive. Have you noticed this in your own life? How sometimes you say the most honest thing you ever said in a roomful of people, and instead of the panic you expected, what you feel is relief. That's what your person was sitting with. A strange, unfamiliar relief. The relief of finally having said something out loud that had been costing them silence for months. And the first intrusive thought arrived right then, while they were watching that candle. Why did it take me this long to admit it? They didn't have an answer, but the question rearranged something in their chest. The night wound down a little while later. People started gathering their things. The friend who had asked the question came over to your person at one point, quietly, and put a hand briefly on their shoulder. Didn't say anything. Just that small physical acknowledgement. I heard you. I am not going to make a thing of it, but I heard you. And then went back to looking for their keys. That small touch nearly undid your person. They didn't show it, but there was a moment, standing by the door, putting on their jacket, where they had to take a slow breath to keep their face still. Then they walked out into the cold. The drive home was quiet. They had the radio off, and if you've been watching me speak for a while, you know what that means. People who don't drive in silence don't suddenly start unless something is moving in them too loudly to compete with. They drove slowly. They took the long way. They sat at one yellow light a little longer than they needed to, even after it turned green, and only moved when the car behind them tapped its horn. When they got home, they didn't go inside right away. They sat in their car in the parking spot. They pulled out their phone. They opened your name in their contacts. They didn't message you, but they stayed on that screen for a long time. Long enough that the screen dimmed once and they had to tap it to bring it back. Long enough that the heater in the car started to cool. Long enough that a small piece of them, the part that had been at war with this for months, finally laid down its weapons. Have you felt this on your end this week? A sudden softening, a quiet warmth, a thought of them that arrived without warning and stayed longer than it should have? That wasn't random. That was the echo of someone, in a parked car under a streetlight, finally looking at your name and not running from it. If this resonates, let it settle in you. Don't rush past it. Now here's where the story takes a turn, because what happened the next morning is the part one really need you to hear. This is the second event, the one that pushed things from a private moment into something they couldn't unsee. The next day, around mid-morning, your person got a message from one of the people who had been at the table the night before. Not the friend who asked the question. Someone else. Someone who had been sitting quietly through most of the evening, watching. The message said something like, "Hey, I don't want to overstep, but I've been thinking about what you said last night. I just want you to know, I've never heard you say a name like that. I've known you for a long time. That was different. Whatever you decide to do, don't bury it again." Your person read it twice. Then they sat down on the edge of their kitchen counter, still in their pajamas, with coffee they hadn't sipped yet going cold in their hand. Because here's what they realized in that moment. The shock in the room hadn't only been about what they said. It had been about how they said it. Their friends had heard something in their voice that they themselves hadn't been able to hear from the inside. Their friends had been carrying, for them, a perception they had been refusing to carry on their own. That's a particular kind of mirror. You can ignore your own feelings for a long time. It's much harder to ignore them when someone you trust says, gently, I saw you. I heard it. You can't pretend that wasn't real. They put the coffee down. They walked to the window. They stood there for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, just the gray light of the morning and a tree that was halfway through losing its leaves. The second intrusive thought arrived at the window. Something about them still stays with me. Just that. Not a plan. Not a decision. Not a sentence about reaching out. Just an acknowledgement, simple as breath, of a truth they had been outrunning. Something about them still stays with me. The kind of thought that doesn't go away once you finally let yourself think it. They spent the rest of that day moving slower than usual. They didn't accomplish much. They tried to work and gave up after an hour. They took a long walk in the middle of the afternoon, which was unlike them, and ended up sitting on a bench in a small park, watching strangers go by, thinking about a specific memory of you that they hadn't let themselves visit in months. The memory was small. That's the thing about real memories. They're never the big ones. It wasn't a vacation or a milestone or anything they could have explained to someone else. It was a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary, where you had said something offhand, a small observation about a person walking past, and they had laughed in a way they hadn't laughed in months. They could hear the laugh in their own head, sitting on that park bench, and they realized they hadn't heard themselves laugh that way since. That was the third intrusive thought. Maybe I haven't been myself since I stopped being around her. That's the one that really did it. That's the one that pinned them to the bench for an extra 15 minutes before they could stand up and walk home. Because you have to understand, people don't realize what someone meant to them by remembering the grand moments. They realize it by noticing the small ways they've gone quiet without them. The laugh that hasn't happened. The opinion that hasn't been said out loud because there's no one in the room who would get it. The slight dimming of their own personality, that they had blamed on stress, or work, or the season, or anything else they could put a label on. It was you. It had always been you. That's what they sat with, on a park bench, in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, while joggers went by and the wind moved through the trees and the light got that slightly bronzed quality it gets in late autumn. There's a verse, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. I bring it up because it explains what happened in that room the night before. Your name didn't come out of them because someone asked a clever question. It came out because the heart was full, and the mouth finally let some of it out. You can't say a name with that kind of weight if the heart isn't already saturated with it. The heart had been saturated for a long time. Now, the pull to reach out is happening. I want you to know that. It's not a fantasy. It's a small, hesitant, real thing happening inside them right now. They are not going to send something dramatic. They are not going to write a paragraph. They are working on something simple. A sentence. Maybe two. The kind of message that says I've been thinking about you without saying it in those exact words, because they want it to sound like them and not like a script. There are drafts. There have already been drafts. Sitting in their notes app, in the back of their phone, untitled and unsent. One of them ends mid-sentence because they didn't know how to finish it. Another one is just your name and a question mark. Another one is longer, almost a paragraph, and it's the one they keep going back to and almost deleting and not quite being able to delete. You don't have to know which one will arrive. You don't have to predict the timing. You only have to know that the architecture is being built, slowly, quietly, in a way that won't be rushed by anyone else's clock. And I want to say something else, because I don't want to leave this part vague. What they said in that room, your name, plainly, without armor, is not a thing they can take back inside themselves. Once you said the truth out loud, in front of witnesses, you cannot return to the version of yourself that was lying about it. That door is closed. They could try, for a few weeks, to act like it didn't happen, but the friends were there. The friend who texted the next morning was there. The room remembers. And every time your person sees one of those people again, that moment will be in the air between them. That's not pressure. That's accountability. The good kind. The kind that quietly forces a person to grow up about something they've been avoiding. So here's what I want you to take with you tonight. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to send a message. You don't have to wait by your phone. You don't have to interpret every coincidence that's been happening this week. You only have to know that you are not imagining the shift. The shift is real. It started in a room you weren't in, at a table you weren't at, when someone asked a question they didn't know would crack a wall open. And it's still moving. Keep being who you are. Keep going to bed at a reasonable hour. Keep showing up to the small ordinary things in your life that have nothing to do with them. Don't perform a transformation. Don't punish yourself for thinking about them. The thinking is allowed. The thinking is, in fact, part of what's connecting the two of you across the silence right now. Because while you've been quietly thinking of them in your own evenings, in your own kitchen, in your own car at red lights, they have been thinking of you too. And last night, for the first time in a long time, they said it out loud, to a room, without taking it back. That name, sitting in the middle of a candlelit table, is the name they are going to be circling back to for the rest of this season of their life. And what they beginning to realize now, is something they can't walk away from anymore. Not this time.